So my name is Trish Whitham. I'm the coordinator at Nuclear Information Service, and I'm going to chair this meeting. So we have three speakers for you today. We've got Shannon, Bugos, David Cullen, and Tim Street, and I'll introduce them individually as we go. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Please stay on mute unless you're speaking. If you'd like to pose a question, there will be a Q&A at the end about 3:30. And so you can either put questions in the chat or you can raise your hand and speak your question yourself. I think that's everything. So before we start, I'd like to, we're going to have a few words from the chair of British Pugwash, Peter Jenkins. Are you there, Peter? Oh, you're on mute, Peter. You can unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I can be extremely brief because I don't want to cut into the time available for our speakers. I just want first, of course, to welcome everybody to this meeting on behalf of the Committee of British Pugwash. I then want to thank you, Trish, for the fact that the Nuclear Information Service is partnering British Pugwash in laying on this meeting. And finally, I'd like to thank our three speakers. I'm sure everyone else shares my interest in hearing what they have to say. Back to you, Trish.
Thanks very much, Peter. And yes, the feeling's reciprocated. It's lovely to be collaborating again. So the first speaker is Dr. Tim Street, and Tim is the Secretary of British Pugwash. He's also a board director with Nuclear Information Service. Tim.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Trish. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be talking about the Ukraine conflict today and Russia's nuclear policy. So the Ukraine conflict continues clearly to be a subject of deep concern. Fears persist regarding the potential use of nuclear weapons by Russia and the widening of the conflict with no apparent end in sight. A new Cold War involving Russia, China, and the West looms on the horizon. US military leaders are briefing that China may invade Taiwan before 2024. It can seem that World War III is around the corner and may have already begun as regional alliances form. So in this talk, I want to explore how we got here, how things may have been different, and how we can decrease tensions and avoid nuclear conflict. So how did this war begin and why did it start last February? So we should recall that in September 2021, the US issued a strategic statement that there was an open door for Ukraine to join NATO and that it would arm Kiev with advanced weapons. President Putin's decision to invade suggests he thought that if he was to prevent Ukraine joining Western ranks, it was now or never. Soon after the war began, US President Joe Biden said that Putin, quote, cannot remain in power. Had Washington set a trap to weaken Russia and bring about Putin's demise? Perhaps. There are certainly echoes of Russia's invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s and the ensuing quagmire, with Soviet troops under constant attack by CIA-armed mujahideen. For example, since 2015, the CIA have been training Ukrainian armed forces. Putin may thus have judged that Russia needed to attack Ukraine while it retained a military advantage over it. But this decision has led Russia into its own quagmire. Ukraine now has around 700,000 troops facing around 150,000 Russian troops who are in bad shape with low morale. Russia's conscription efforts have been beset with problems, and it is reportedly running low on longer range missiles. Europe and NATO have united behind Washington's leadership. Russian public support for the war is waning, and elites are questioning Putin's handling of the conflict. Initially, Putin held back on using all means at his disposal. But as Russia retreats and as winter approaches, its military is increasingly using armed drones and targeting infrastructure and energy facilities. The Ukraine conflict has confirmed what many people in Western militaries knew before the conflict, namely that the Russian military is strong in some areas, such as nuclear weapons, but otherwise has limited power projection capabilities. Furthermore, the US is developing capabilities which Moscow sees as posing a serious threat to its nuclear arsenal, particularly as this reduces in size over time. US capabilities of main concern include its ballistic missile defense systems, currently in Romania and under construction in Poland, and precision strike missiles. We should therefore critically examine the claims that Putin wants to or has the means to create a new Russian empire. Russia's military power is clearly modest and is quickly being drained. We should also carefully think about the causes and consequences of the US wanting to degrade the Russian armed forces and fight the last Ukrainian, in the words of one retired US diplomat. For example, the Estonian defense minister has argued that it will take 2 to 4 years to rebuild Russia's military to its strength before the conflict. In 2024, Putin will face re-election. If he is planning to run, he will not want to have to justify a weak and defeated military to the Russian people. He needs a win and may lash out if there is no off-ramp. The stakes are rising steadily. The Ukrainian people are likely to suffer more and the risks of nuclear weapon use are low but are prominent and growing. So what are the chances of a peace deal? At present, Moscow and Kiev are far apart. Last October, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a decree ruling out talks with Putin. In September, Putin had threatened to use all means at his disposal to defend Russian territory, at the same time as declaring the annexation of 4 more Ukrainian regions. Subsequently, Ukraine submitted an application to join NATO. Zelensky had previously indicated a willingness for Ukraine to be neutral. A long-standing red line for Russia has been that Ukraine rules out joining the military alliance. In any case, there are several barriers to Ukrainian membership. For example, Ukraine couldn't realistically be defended by NATO because of the resources required to secure its long border with Russia. Whilst Kiev feels victory is in sight and is pushing to regain all its lost territory, many analysts warn of a protracted conflict. Russia's occupation of Crimea, which it captured in the 2014 war, is now in the crosshairs as Ukrainian forces advance south via the city of Kherson. Were such gains as Crimea to be threatened, Russia could use more devastating types of military power, particularly if Putin is increasingly pressured at home. The rhetoric of Putin and other Kremlin officials has raised fears that Russia might use nuclear weapons first to break a stalemate or avoid defeat. We need to consider Russia's nuclear doctrine, which is laid out in its strategic documents, to understand Moscow's thinking in this area. The key document here states that, quote, "The Russian Federation reserves the right to use nuclear weapons in response to the use of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction against it and or its allies, as well as in the case of aggression against the Russian Federation using conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is threatened." Other Russian policy announcements have led analysts to assert that Moscow is raising the salience of tactical nuclear weapons. A heated debate has ensued over whether Russia might threaten to escalate to nuclear use to deter a conflict threatening the existence of the state. However, Putin stated in a 2018 speech that, quote, "Our strategy of nuclear weapons use doesn't envision a preemptive strike. Our concept is a launch under attack. Only when we become convinced that there is an incoming attack on the territory of Russia, and that happens within seconds, only after that would we launch a retaliatory strike." Whilst it is uncertain what Russia's actual nuclear doctrine is, what is certain is that the direct involvement of US and NATO in the conflict would increase the potential for nuclear use by Russia. A continuation of Ukrainian drone strikes into Russia could also cause some sort of escalation. In addition, we must remember that whilst France, the UK, and the US criticize Putin's nuclear threats as, quote, "military coercion, intimidation, or blackmail," they reserve the right to base their security policy on nuclear threats. These 3 states justified their nuclear posture at a high-level international conference in July as, quote, "serving defensive purposes, deterring aggression, and preventing war." As Paul Rogers has noted, the UK's own nuclear posture is based on first use, with several options for the use of lower yield warheads. Returning to Russia's nuclear arsenal, it currently deploys around 1,500 warheads at missile and bomber bases or on submarines at sea. The remainder of the Russian nuclear stockpile is in central storage. This includes so-called tactical nuclear weapons. These bombs may have a relatively lower yield, the lowest being around 10 kilotons per warhead, but this is similar to the yield of the bomb dropped by the US on Hiroshima in World War II. Despite this, some analysts argue that tactical nuclear use wouldn't be an effective military option for Moscow because of the sheer numbers required to be decisive. For others, a demonstration detonation in an unpopulated area, a high altitude explosion using an electromagnetic shock, or an underground test may be more feasible. Yet each of these options would themselves carry significant political costs. The case therefore remains that it is not possible to know Russia's exact plans in this area, but it would be prudent not to put Putin and the Kremlin in a position where nuclear use seems like their least worst option. So to wrap up and conclude, Russia is waging an illegal war of aggression, likely involving multiple war crimes, but there were opportunities to both avoid the war and end it in its early stages. The main aspects of the potential peace deal are known. Key factors include significant autonomy for the Donbass region to be determined by a referendum run by international officials, Ukraine adopting neutral status, and the status of Crimea to be revisited at a later date. Other key questions will include the sanctions regime and security guarantees. Ultimately, we need a plan to end the war to prevent more Ukrainian and Russian lives being wasted. Even victors need a plan for the peace. Russia and the Ukraine are not going anywhere, and nor are there essential security concerns. But if the West's endgame is regime change in the Kremlin, this war could drag on indefinitely. Putin will one day leave office, but his fate and successor need to be chosen by the Russian people. We therefore need to think about how the West should behave if it wants Russia to move towards democratic rule and stop relying on fossil fuels and nuclear weapons. The priority must therefore be a peace deal that enables future cooperation between East and West on arms control and disarmament and concentrates national resources on fighting the climate crisis. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Tim. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next speaker. That was a very insightful session. Thanks so much for that, Tim. So the next speaker is David Cullen, who is the Director at Nuclear Information Service. He's also our main researcher and report author. He's going to talk a bit more about nuclear weapons and the modernisation.
Hi there, and thanks very much to Pugwash for co-hosting this webinar. I'm going to talk a bit about our research, which we published earlier this year in September and August, in a report called Extreme Circumstances. This report looked at a number of things. The primary focus was the UK's replacement warhead programme, but we also looked into the UK's lower yield nuclear capability and its current status. I'll towards the end of my this talk, hopefully the links with Ukraine will become clear. I'll get into those later. But first of all, the lower yield capability. So this is something that the UK government was quite unabashed about discussing in the early years of the Trident programme. At the time, the UK was in the process of phasing out its so-called tactical WE-177 air-launched nuclear weapons, and the government was keen, at the time, government was keen to make it clear that low yield nuclear weapons was still something that the UK could field. The exact form that this lower yield capability took wasn't made public, but it was something that was discussed as a capability the UK had. When we looked into it as part of the Extreme Circumstances report, it seemed quite clear, all the evidence pointed towards this capability having been delivered by a variant of the UK Trident warhead that had a dummy secondary. So that is the secondary stage of the thermonuclear warhead was replaced with an identical but non-active component. So the only nuclear yield from the explosion of this variant would have been the primary, the lower yield part of the warhead. It seems to have been tested in this configuration in the early 1990s before the moratorium on live testing. And it also seems pretty likely that it was functionally, if not completely, identical to the design of the US W76-2, the recently fielded lower yield submarine launched warheads announced by the Trump administration. And it seems now certain to continue in the US arsenal under the Biden administration. In the UK, the original intent and probably the practice was that this lower yield variant would have been carried on different missiles on Trident submarines, and the intent was for a range of strike options, possibly two, possibly more than two, to have been available to planners at the time. It seems, although we don't have any hard evidence, that this practice, and indeed possibly the actual stock of these variant warheads, was discontinued in the 2010s. At that time, we had some quite clear information about the numbers of missiles and the numbers of warheads that were carried on Trident submarines as they went out on patrol, the UK's Trident submarines, I should say. And the potential for this practice of carrying a range of warhead loads was somewhat diminished by the numbers and the clarity about the numbers. So it may have been discontinued at the time. However, since the integrated review in 2021, where the UK made a surprise announcement that it was going to increase the cap on its nuclear weapon stockpile, and also it was going to discontinue providing a lot of this informational clarity about warhead and missile loads on the submarines. I think a question mark has arisen about whether this lower yield capability remains discontinued. So some of the language in the integrated review is analogous to language used in the early years of the Trident program, and indeed in the doctrine around the W76-2, suggesting that again there's a desire or a potential desire for a range of strike options to be available to the UK. There has been a heightened amount of nuclear convoy movements in recent years. This is certainly potentially corresponding to the increase in warheads announced in the integrated review, but it's also could correspond with activity to convert some of the warhead stockpile to this lower yield variant. So I said when I began speaking that I'd come back to the links with Ukraine. The rationale at the time, the early years of the Trident program, when this lower yield capability was confirmed by and justified by the government, it was justified in terms of providing what was called a credible response to a putative lower yield use by a so-called adversary state. So this idea that were another state to use lower yield nuclear weapons, planners should be have available to them the potential to respond in kind with a lower yield nuclear strike rather than a full strategic size strike. There is, of course, some question over whether, as Tim alluded to, this so-called escalate to de-escalate strategy exists in Russian nuclear doctrine, but it is very clear that some amount of planning and construction of nuclear posture on both sides of the Atlantic is being undertaken with the assumption that this doctrine does in fact exist, and that nuclear planners should be given options to respond in kind. What's quite interesting, I think, in the case of Ukraine is that we're looking at, hypothetically, but certainly more closer to actual reality than has been the case in the past, a possible lower yield use by Russia, as Tim alluded to. So we're looking at a hypothetical but close to paradigmatic scenario that these lower yield weapons were designed around and planned for. And it's quite clear both that as far as we can see, there's not a major deterrent effect from these lower yield weapons, and a lower yield capability, if it exists in the UK, certainly does in the US. But what is very clear is that these lower yield weapons represent unnecessary and terrifying and escalatory step that we really want to avoid if at all possible. So I hope that once the war is brought to a just and peaceful end as soon as possible, that there's a renewed focus on eliminating so-called sub-strategic weapons as soon as possible. Again, thanks for listening and looking forward to your questions.
Thanks very much for that, David. So our final speaker, can you hear me? Our final speaker today is Shannon Bugos from Arms Control Association, where she's a senior policy analyst, and she also writes for Arms Control Today. Over to you, Shannon. Can you unmute, Shannon?
Oh, there we go. No, you're good. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's good to be here. So my task today is to talk a bit about nuclear risk reduction and arms control between the United States and Russia, especially, as you could probably tell from our two previous speakers, as Putin's reprehensible war on Ukraine continues. So at the very start of the war, the United States, understandably and rightly, indefinitely suspended the US-Russian Strategic Stability Dialogue, which is a long-standing forum in which the two sides planned to lay the groundwork for a more formal bilateral arms control talks to address the only current but soon expiring nuclear arms control agreement between them, the 2010 New START Treaty. So Biden has emphasized, however, that no matter what else is happening in the world, the US is ready to pursue critical arms control measures. This statement is very important, I think, because it emphasizes the fact that arms control provides proven benefits for increasing transparency, predictability, and stability, even, or maybe even especially so, in times of conflict and uncertainty. So formal arms control talks should be on a separate track from the strategic stability dialogue. I just brought up the dialogue because I think it's an important, laying the groundwork for the formal arms control talks to come later. The Biden administration has said, though, that before launching those formal talks, it first wants to see a resumption of on-site inspections that have been paused for nearly 3 years now, due first to the pandemic and now since August due to Russian implementation concerns. So US and Russian officials were scheduled to meet in Cairo at the end of November to discuss this very issue of the resumption of inspections, but Moscow unfortunately canceled this at the last minute. Overall, this does not bode particularly well for an imminent start to arms control dialogue, among many other factors. This is a concern, however, as the time before New START expires in February 2026 is winding down. And if New START does expire with no replacement or no agreement to continue adhering to it, the US and Russian nuclear arsenals will be without constraints for the first time since 1972. Launching these formal arms control negotiations on a New START replacement, as Russia continues to commit more illegal atrocities in Ukraine, will take tremendous political will. And I do want to emphasize that Washington having arms control talks with Russia does not mean that the United States approves of Russia's illegal actions in Ukraine. I think that is a point that we take great effort to emphasize, particularly in politicized DC and Congress right now. So and we're emphasizing this in the importance of arms control because given the risks that the Russian nuclear arsenal poses, it remains essential that the United States, with support from its allies and partners, engages in the serious nose-to-the-grindstone negotiations with Russia, because a Russian nuclear arsenal with no limits or transparency would only heighten the risks of unintended or intended nuclear escalation and miscalculation in areas of conflict, such as Ukraine. So the first two steps I view that Moscow and Washington should take as soon as possible is to, one, launch those formal bilateral negotiations on a new arms control framework. And framework, that word in particular, is kind of what the Biden administration has landed on to talk about a post-New START world. And then second, to end the Russian restriction of New START on-site inspections at its nuclear facilities subject to the treaty, and to cooperate in the resumption of those inspections soon thereafter. Though this last point, I have shifted my views on it a little bit over the past month or so, because I view the launching of the dialogue to be more like a long-term greater good. And as frustrating as the lack of on-site inspections has been, I don't necessarily view negotiations on a New START follow-on that they should be contingent on the resumption of inspections. But Biden administration has kind of made that as the starting point for talking about negotiations, which does make sense simply because it will show, in the Biden administration's eyes, it will show Russian goodwill towards arms control. So to speak more specifically about the main objectives, the possible main objectives for the new arms control framework, it should first of all prioritize the establishment of central limits that further reduce the size of US and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals, as well as incorporate new nuclear weapon capabilities. So the new limit for strategic nuclear warheads could be lowered from 1,550 to 1,000. And this rests on the fact that in 2013, the Obama administration determined that the US nuclear arsenal could be reduced by up to 1/3 below the New START level without any ill effects on US national security and nuclear deterrence. Yes, it's been 10 years, and although the strategic environment has changed since then, with particularly Russia's new nuclear weapon delivery systems, as well as China's expanding nuclear arsenal, so have US nuclear weapon systems advanced in their abilities. And so at the end of the day, like for like limitations are not particularly helpful in today's day and age. On this issue of central limits, at the very least, if the United States and Russia arrive in 2026 with no new arms control arrangement or framework, the two countries should make a mutual commitment to continue adhering to the current central limits of New START until such an arrangement is in place. And again, the lowering the central limits is ideal. So continuing in this somewhat of an ideal world, once those central limits are taken care of, if we then are in a place to add on to the arms control agenda, the United States and Russia could consider that the new arrangement also prohibit the development or limit the deployment of at least some of the types of missiles formerly banned by the INF Treaty. This treaty, which the United States left in 2019, banned all ground-launched nuclear and conventional ballistic and cruise missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500, or sorry, 5,500 kilometers. The motivation to pursue a variation of the INF Treaty rests on the fact that neither the United States nor Russia can afford another expensive, unnecessary arms race with another class of weapon. And simply put, these weapons heighten tensions. And kind of as somewhat of a side note, US military officials have already expressed skepticism over the efforts to bring ground-launched intermediate-range missiles to the Army, and noted that there have been issues with locations to actually base these missiles in both Europe and Asia. And then next on the list of ideal priorities for the future of arms control are non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons. with an estimated 1,900 Russian tactical nuclear weapons in central storage and 100 US tactical nuclear weapons deployed across Europe. These are a point of interest for both countries. With numerous challenges ahead for incorporating those tactical nuclear weapons into the next US-Russian arms control agreement. A simple option to begin tactical nuclear arms control could be to agree to exchange detailed declarations on tactical nuclear stockpiles, including warheads in storage. And the next item on the list that is a main priority for Russia is US missile defenses. Honestly, given Russian as well as Chinese long-term concerns about US missile defenses, there is almost no way in which a new arms control arrangement would be reached without addressing US missile defense systems. These systems, particularly those meant to intercept strategic threats, do not perform reliably and effectively even under the most scripted of circumstances, and therefore do not provide reliable protection, making it at the end no great loss to agree to reasonable limits on those systems. Lastly, the new agreement should maintain an on-site inspections and verification regime similar to that of New START that continues to provide valuable information that cannot necessarily be attained through other avenues. And a quick note on China before I close is that Beijing has repeatedly dismissed requests to partake in US-Russian nuclear arms control, especially as its arsenal remains smaller than the other two countries. Therefore, the best route at this time is for the US to continue to work with China on officially establishing a US-Chinese strategic stability dialogue that includes risk reduction among its main topics of discussion. And risk reduction is viewed very differently from arms control, particularly with China. So it's important to emphasize the risk reduction factor and not necessarily arms control. And then one more quick note to say that this new arms control framework or arrangement doesn't need to take the form of a single agreement. It could be a collection of agreements, right? So the concerns on the table are very wide-ranging and will require very tailored measures to mitigate the specific risks they present and to, if applicable, impose any limitations. Plus, if the two countries aim to ramp up the discussions on new and emerging technologies with strategic effects, the majority of that tech will almost certainly have to be addressed in like side agreements or separate avenues than the current structure of New START. Thanks for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Shannon. That was, yeah, fascinating insight, and everyone can stay up to date with what's happening by looking at the arms control. Is it armscontrol.org website and Arms Control Today? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Right, so we'd like to open it up now. So if anybody's got any questions, I'm sure some of the panelists will also have questions. You can raise your hand and we will try to get to you, or you can post your question in the chat. Who's first? Stuart Parkinson. Go ahead, Stuart.
Hi, thanks very much for the presentations. That was really interesting. The one question I had was around the UK's. Now the UK had its integrated review in 2020, at the end of 2020, start of 2021, and as David said, they changed their nuclear, announced an increase in Britain's nuclear arsenal for the first time and made various other changes. And I wonder to what extent that affected Putin's decision-making around whether or not to go to war in Ukraine. Was it indicative of the way things were going in Europe as well as what was happening in the US, and thinking there is no scope for peace with NATO, not even the European partners, and was that a factor in his decision making, do you think?
Who would like to take that question from Stuart? Stuart, you're with Scientists for Global Responsibility, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Dave, do you want to go for it, or shall I kick off?
You go first. I need to mull this one over, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I also see Margaret's got her hand up, and I might ask a question in a sec. I don't like I said in my presentation, I think from what I've read and what I understand, what may have been uppermost in Russia's mind were things more to do with how NATO, including the US and the UK, were since 2015 in different ways, both with the CIA and other branches of the military beefing up and supporting the Ukraine military through training, through logistical intelligence support and other types of military support, both naval and for special and armed forces. Basically providing NATO grade support in the Ukraine without Ukraine becoming a member. So I think that the UK beefing up its warhead cap was part of the music, part of the general tenor of the UK's direction in train with US strategic thinking, in terms of, obviously it's in line with where the US is going with this and has been for a while, and Russia knows that. But I think, you know, Russia sees the UK's nuclear arsenal as part of the US's and integrated with NATO, and incremental increases like this, while significant, if we're looking at 40% increase over the next few years, I think it's part of Russia's general sense that the West is less interested in arms control and disarmament than maybe had been previously, but I don't think it was the determining factor. It may have played a role in the general sense of general calculations, as I said, about the timing of the need to invade Ukraine at that moment, but I don't think it was a primary concern.
Okay, thanks both.
I can chip in on that a little bit. I think I broadly agree with Tim. The focus, as I understand it, insofar as Russia has been forthright and honest about its motivations, the focus was much more on the status of Ukraine. And although in relative terms, the increase under the integrated review was a large step up in the size of the UK arsenal, it was a 40% increase above the level that they were supposed to be reducing to prior to the announcement. It's still very small compared to the US and Russian arsenal. So I would be surprised if that increase would have been had a major effect on Russian strategic thinking, but we'll see.
Thanks for that, Dave. Any more on that? Let's move on to Margaret Forbes.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm a lay person, but I'm greatly interested in the nuclear thing, and I have not heard any diplomatic, not even one syllable, not a diplomatic syllable has come from the British Foreign Secretary or from the US. There's been nothing but threatening language as far as I can see as a lay person. That's more or less a comment rather than a question.
Thanks, Margaret. Does anybody like to respond to that?
I'm going to really briefly respond, and thanks for the point. I think that it's certainly the case that if you look at Boris Johnson's trips over to the Ukraine, to Kiev, to meet with President Zelensky, and the UK's supply of over £2 billion worth of arms in 2022, and Liz Truss's commitment to match that figure in 2023, and the incredible diversity of arms that the UK and the US at a much greater level is providing to the Ukraine. Clearly they are presenting this as something that's necessary for the self-defense of the Ukraine, but there's also a much longer term question of to what purpose, to what end is this? And the West's hitherto, well, I say the West, I'm focused on the US and UK here, and the idea of this kind of maximalist position of Ukrainian victory and regaining all its territory may seem attractive, but in the long run, this is fueling the war and really militarizing the region and Ukraine itself. So we have to really look at the UK's diplomatic position here and say, is it right that we are egging on and preventing a diplomatic routes to end this conflict? Obviously now we're in a different position than we were a few months ago, but yeah, I think we need to really look into the UK's diplomatic behaviour over recent months with regards to Ukraine.
Thanks, Tim. There's a question in the chat. Do you see that one, Tim? It's
Ian's got his hand up as well.
yes. Okay. Which one do you want to take first?
Shall we take Ian's question then Peter Williams?
Go ahead, Ian.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, hello. I'm Ian Crossland. I'm with Pugwash member. It strikes me that Putin isn't going anywhere soon. This Ukraine conflict has increased repression, and he's simply digging in even further. So I think any hope that he will somehow be pushed out is probably futile, because he has a very firm grip on all those around him, and they all depend on him for their income and position and so forth. And you know, the way things have been going there, it's clear he's just digging himself in, and he'll only be 72 in 2024. So I don't see him going anywhere very soon. So if that option is ruled out, it seems to me that what's been happening in the last few years is an erosion of trust. You know, and the British move to increase their nuclear weapons is simply another symptom of that. All the things that have been said in America, and then you throw China into the mix as well. So it's very difficult to see a way out of this. And I just wonder if there are any ideas about somehow improving trust in some way, to you know, try to get the sides talking, so that we can at least make some progress. Because at the moment, I don't see any prospect of an improvement, and no hope whatsoever of negotiations on New Start or whatever else you want to call it. Sorry to be so gloomy.
Thank you very much for that. Anybody want to come back on that before we move on to Peter Williams?
I'm happy to jump in on this one. And Ian, I certainly share your gloomy outlook at times. Everything that I outlined, like I had said, is more of an ideal world. And so not to add to the gloom and doom, but I know I had mentioned that meeting that was supposed to take place in Cairo at the end of November, and everything that we heard about why the meeting was called off is that it came from the top, and it came from pretty high up, which obviously is rather unfortunate, because we were hoping to have that meeting to get the on-site inspections on track, which would lay the groundwork, or help kind of pave the way to start those formal arms control negotiations. So it does not seem that that meeting is going to be rescheduled anytime soon. There was maybe for a hot second a thought that maybe at the end of January. I don't think that's likely. So just in terms of ways to improve trust, maybe see some progress. I mean, first and foremost, this inspections issue in the Biden administration's eyes would go a long way. Resolving that issue would go a long way towards demonstrating that Russia is a partner that's working in good faith, is the term that's been used a few times. And so this would mean trying to get the US and allies on the same page for restarting those inspections and what it all means, or the different pieces that it means, including kind of opening up facilities for inspectors, getting inspectors where they need to go, things like that. And arms control in general, I view as an exercise, as a trust building exercise, right? So to have these communications would be really good. And even if there is not a resolution for the on-site inspections issue, if the US and Russia are able to reschedule the meeting that was supposed to happen at the end of November and are sitting down to talk about arms control issues, I would view that as a plus. And that's a really low bar, but this is the reality we're in right now. And so just to have that communication, I think would go a long way in ensuring that they're still talking about arms control and that conversation is not going to be overtaken by issues that Russia had raised in the January strategic stability dialogue that had veered away from the traditional strategic stability agenda. So that's one small piece that I think would make a lot of progress given where we're at right now.
Thanks for that hope, Shannon. We have a question there from Peter Williams. He's asking, it's a question for Pugwash people. Has Putin's threat of using nuclear weapons strengthened or weakened the long-term aims of Pugwash? Who would like to take that?
I'll answer very briefly, but I'm conscious of talking a lot, so I'm gonna, after I talk, pose a question to David and Shannon, if that's okay. So the question is about whether if I can read it again, has Putin's threat of using nuclear weapons strengthened or weakened the long-term aims of Pugwash? I think at the moment we're in an extremely dangerous situation, and the peace movement and the disarmament movement around the world, in the West, in the UK and the US and other countries that are party to this conflict or involved in this conflict, responded quite slowly, and obviously our attention is split on in multiple ways, because we have to deal with thinking about the climate crisis, thinking about COVID, thinking about austerity, and all these different issues. And it can seem like there's very limited political space to discuss big picture alternatives, but I think that's why organizations like Pugwash actually are very important and do matter. And the same goes for Nuclear Information Services and Arms Control Association, because they're able to provide a critical independent outlook and an alternative to the kind of business as usual politics and policies that exist in states and state institutions. Now, obviously, whether we can make a difference and actually change to some degree the course of policy and enable a revitalization of arms control, disarmament, and strategic stability in Europe is up to us to pressure our governments, because we have that ability in the West. Whereas in Russia, there's obviously much less freedom and ability to do so. So I'd say this is the time when activism and debate and dialogue really matters more than anything else. But yeah, my question I just really wanted to cheekily pose to David and Shannon is, firstly to David, is about, in terms of an incoming perhaps Labour government, what do you think their priorities might be or should be? Would you propose to them on arms control and disarmament and around the nuclear field? And for Shannon, I was interested to hear your thoughts about the nuclear posture review recently, and on a more technical level about how to reassure Russia that the US's BMD deployments in Eastern Europe couldn't possibly be reconfigured for offensive purposes. So I'd be interested to hear both your thoughts on those questions, if that's okay. And I know that then there's other questions. Thanks.
Would you like to go first, Shannon? I feel like I've also spoken a fair amount.
Sure, I'm happy to. Thanks for your question, Tim. So on the NPR, I mean, bottom line up front, it was somewhat disappointing, but on the other hand, expected. So there was a big push for the Biden administration to really rethink particularly the US declaratory policy. The Biden administration did land on fundamental purpose. So the fundamental purpose of the US nuclear arsenal is to deter and, if necessary, retaliate against a nuclear weapon strike. So there was kind of no first use or sole purpose were the options on the table that a lot of groups were advocating for. In the end, I kind of think of the Biden administration NPR as a mixture of Obama's and Trump's, right? So Obama on declaratory policy had the same thing. And then the pieces of the Trump administration NPR that worked its way in were particularly some nuclear weapon capabilities. So some were abandoned, some were kept, like the low yield W76-2. So you can see it's just a mixture. I don't view it as particularly unexpected. This was a lot of essentially over the past 2 years, we've had a lot of kind of insight into how the Biden administration was handling the nuclear weapons arsenal and policies. And so this is somewhat in line with what we've seen of not rapidly changing the course from the Trump era while reverting to some Obama era policies. And then second, on reassuring Russia on the BMD in Europe. And I think this one has a somewhat straightforward solution, and it's not anything new, is to hold a small demonstration of the system to ensure, or particularly of the interceptors, to ensure that they cannot be reconfigured for offensive purposes, because I think that's kind of the main sticking point. There has been talk about having that demonstration or visit by Russian inspectors. Russia had included it as well as part of its proposal, which was flawed. I still view it as a potential starting point, but its proposal for like post-INF world for a moratorium, there we go, that's the word I was looking for, moratorium on the deployment of INF range missiles, as well as some mutual verification mechanisms. And so this was a piece of that. So it's been on the table. I think that would be a fairly straightforward way to handle it.
Thanks, Shannon. We now have Rob Forsyth. We've got 2 more hands
Trish,
up.
I did ask Dave a question as
Oh,
well.
sorry, Tim. Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
No problem. Priorities for an incoming Labour government. I wouldn't. This is a wish list. I wouldn't hold that much hope of these things being acted upon. But were I to compile a wish list, I think I would really like to see some clarity on what I've been talking about today. This lower yield capability. I'd like to see a statement on its current status and a commitment to phasing it out at the earliest possible opportunity, and some sort of as binding as possible commitment not to recommence it. I'd like to see the UK adopt a proper no first use policy. Its weapons, as far as we can tell, are very much designed around a second use scenario. And I don't think that there's a very strong case that the UK would lose very much from adopting a proper no first use posture. I'd like to see a lot more transparency. I'd like to see them put something meaningful on the table at the NPT, but we're really getting into cloud cuckoo land here in terms of where things currently stand. One more thing I'd mention is in extreme circumstances, one of the things that the major recommendation was that for the replacement warhead project, which I think by the time a Labour government comes in will be fairly underway and is very unlikely to be cancelled or amended. But what I would like to see is a clear policy from government that if this is going ahead, that it's not going to involve an increase in capabilities, and it's going to be designed such that it can be easily verifiably disarmed when the UK finally lives up to its disarmament commitments, that it's designed in such a way that components aren't going to wear out and there's not going to be a justification for further warhead models down the line, that kind of thing.
Thanks, Dave. Okay, and the extreme circumstances that you referred to is our new report, which is available on our website. So Rob Forsyth, are you able to ask your question? I think it's for Tim.
Thanks, Trish. Now I've got the technology sorted out. Yes, two quick observations first. The new Dreadnought class submarines, of course, carry less warheads than do the Vanguard class. They only carry 96 warheads each, which perhaps puts in perspective the increase in warheads may be more political than practical. Secondly, if you're the recipient of an incoming Trident missile, you won't actually be able to identify whether it's a low yield or a full yield warhead, and whether it's fired by an American or a Royal Navy submarine, which therefore you probably would tend to suppose the worst case. So the firing of a low yield warhead might not necessarily have the effect you desired of indicating less threat. But my question is for Tim Street, and I just wondered whether what he feels is the impact, or might be the impact, on the situation in Ukraine now, by the statement of the G20 in Bali recently that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, a statement made at government level which is quite unique, really, and will that have any impact?
I'm muting myself. Thanks, Rob, for your comments. I think anything that reinforces the nuclear taboo, anything that strengthens the political sense that nuclear threats by any nuclear weapon state are inadmissible, and draws attention to previous rulings by the International Court of Justice regarding the threat or use of nuclear weapons being illegal and against international law in its several guises. And also that maybe brings people's attentions to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and states' commitments to agreements such as the NPT are all to the good. But ultimately, because of the centralization of control of these weapons, there needs to be, in the long run, or the medium to long run, as I've written about, political control being wrestled away from the centralized military establishments, so that there is democratic control of these weapons. And I think whilst international pressure is welcome, there also needs to be domestic pressure too, and that includes from British and American citizens.
Thanks, Tim and Rob. So we're running short of time now, so we're going to need to speed up a little bit, but we have a question now from Augustin Blanco Bazan. Go ahead, Augustin.
Thank you very much. I'm a Pugwash member. It has been already said that apparently Putin's strategy is not going anywhere, but may I just correct it? Putin's strategy may be not to go anywhere. He can sit and wait and go on with the same thing, really. I would suggest that it's not the first step to prevent a nuclear attack or whatever may happen, to try to desperately get a ceasefire in this very moment. Nobody talks about it. Apparently, Mr. Zelensky doesn't want a ceasefire unless he reconquers Crimea. And well, nobody seems to have to develop this strategy, really, to get a ceasefire as a first step to start talking and to start negotiating in the way it has been suggested. It's a little bit a question or a comment, yeah. Then Labour plays second fiddle to the Conservative government in both international politics and in Europe, and then the Conservative government plays second fiddle to the United States. I mean, that's all. I mean, those questions are easy to answer, I would say. So, but my main question is about a ceasefire as the first step. What do you think about it? I mean, sort of, is it not the best way of preventing a nuclear attack in the world we are, in the situation we are facing now? Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to come back on that? Tim.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm kind of hesitating because I didn't want to continue talking, but very briefly, yeah, I think that obviously the pushback on there being a ceasefire by people who argue that this will give Putin and the Russia breathing space to rearm, to retrench, to train up its military, and to have another go, have another bite of the cherry. And yes, that may be the case, but in the meantime, Ukrainian people have had their water cut off, their electricity cut off, their heating cut off. The war, as I've outlined, we could escalate it as further strikes take place both within the Ukraine by Russia, and Ukraine now seems to have given the green light to conduct strikes into Russian territory. As regional actors get further involved through arming each of the different sides, the war could spread to other parts of the region. So I would obviously welcome peace talks, and that needs to be linked to the ceasefire, but clearly there needs to be a political discussion as well as just a ceasefire, because I don't think we'll get anywhere without that.
Great, yes, thank you. And thanks, Shannon, for coming back on Martin's question in the chat. I think there's one more question. Well, it's a comment, but maybe there's somebody who would like to respond to David Wolf's question that or comment that we haven't really spoken about what the West's response would be if there was a nuclear attack on Kyiv.
I can comment on this just briefly. I mean, so far we haven't heard anything from the West besides the fact that there would be severe consequences, but we do know behind the scenes, at least speaking from Washington, that the Biden administration, and I think the UK as well, though someone correct me if this isn't true, but the Biden administration has held tabletop exercises to figure out what the various response options might be, whether political, economic, military, a mixture of all of that. Besides that, we don't really know anything. I mean, France has ruled off responding with nuclear weapons a few weeks ago. And so beyond that, we don't have much information, but that is something that, I mean, it's an ongoing conversation. It's something that we continue to ask officials about. I don't anticipate getting any more information simply because the administration doesn't want to reveal it. But that's at least kind of some of the background stuff that's happening on that issue, if that's helpful.
Thank you. We've got one final question. Did anyone else want to come back on that? Tim?
Well, Trish, I was going to say behind my questions, Tim Street, I think I was correct in reading somewhere that both Biden and NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg had said, well, were a tactical nuclear weapon to be used, the reaction would be massive, overwhelming conventional attack on Russia, which would devastate Russia. So I was wondering whether there was a shift away from a nuclear response to a massive conventional one, and whether the G20 statement had been in line with it. That was behind my question.
Thanks for clarifying. Dave?
It's a really tricky one. My which is not contradicting anything anyone said. My sense is that appears to be the type of response that would be fielded were this to happen, and I think that's why in my talk I said that I feel that the lower yield nuclear weapons actually, when push comes to shove, are an unnecessary and dangerous option to have rather than a useful one. I think it quite clearly both for domestic and probably also for what they perceive as strategic reasons. The Biden administration don't want to rule out a nuclear response, but it seems that, you know, for example, the position of China vis-a-vis pressurizing Washington post a putative nuclear response would make a conventional response much more likely to have the desired effects and better consequences as far as Washington's concerned.
Thanks, Dave. Margaret, you had a final question just before we close? There you go.
Final comment is the talk of nuclear response. US, I think Shannon said that the US wants a nuclear arms so that they can retaliate against a nuclear strike. Sorry, was that muted? Did you hear me?
No, we heard you.
All right, right. So does nobody understand that a retaliatory response is mutually assured destruction and we're all dead? Or is that just a stupid response, a stupid question from a layperson who's a peace activist?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think I caught most of what you said, Margaret. And just that is mutual assured destruction is part of that policy, right? And I think if I'm understanding right, or I'm trying to pinpoint exactly what part you had mentioned from my remarks. And I just want to emphasize, similar to what Tim and David did, that the Biden administration has not necessarily ruled out a nuclear response in total, which I certainly view as I hope that they do. Thus far, they have said that they don't see any reason to change US nuclear posture in response to what's happening in Ukraine. So I view that as like a good sign. Though they haven't necessarily said nuclear weapons are entirely off the table, everything else suggests that that is the case. And so I view that as a good step.
Thanks very much, Shannon. So I think we are coming to the end now. It's 4:10. So anything that we have missed that's in the chat, we'll try to get back to people individually. We hope that you can find the link to this recording should you want to watch it again or share it with somebody who missed it. Then it's going to be in the next few days. It'll be on our YouTube channel, Nuclear Information Service YouTube channel, and you'll be able to find it via our website, nuclearinfo.org. Otherwise, it just remains for me to thank all of our speakers very much for coming along for this important discussion, and thank all of you participants also for coming and joining in and for your questions. Thank you. Goodbye.